everything we know about manumission in places that allowed it suggests that slaves were willing to pay more than the market. Of course they would. It's their freedom. Nobody's going to value it more than them. So why is it that they are not offered these contracts to show their talent and earn their freedom? I think if that had happened in the U.S. South, and sometimes it was illegal to allow slaves to do that. If that had been part of the American story, I think we would have a very different history of racial tensions in this country.
Welcome to Season 2 of Our Long Walk, a podcast series about South Africa's past, present and future. I'm Johan Fourie from Stellenbosch University, and as always, I'm joined by Wits University's brilliant Jonathan Schoots.
With Johan's expertise in economic history and my expertise in historical sociology, we are excited to interview world-leading academics who ask compelling questions about our country, our continent, and the ideas shaping the world around us.
Warren Whatley is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Michigan and an expert on the economic history of Africa and African Americans in the United States. He has published widely in economics and economic history journals, and is the author of Slavery, Freedom and Development, How Africa Became the Mirror Image of Europe, by Cambridge University Press, published earlier this year. Welcome, Warren.
Thank you. Love your podcast.
Warren, it's so lovely to have you here with us.
Thank you for having me.
As a first question, you opened your book with this preface where you outline your own history as the co-founder of the Pan-African Student Union at the University of Baghdad in Iraq. So tell us a little bit about this experience in Iraq and how this history shaped the storytelling that you do in this book.
Boy, this was back in undergraduate school. And people have been asking me to memorialize this forever. Strangers would walk up to me and say, "You're that guy who traveled a lot in your youth." Yeah, that's me. And whenever I get a chance like this to broadcast a call to reconnect with some of my comrades and friends from that experience, I jump at it. Okay, so this is my experience in Baghdad, Iraq, right after the Yom Kippur War, 1974. A group of students from Shaw University, which is a small black college in North Carolina, for your international listeners, were given the opportunity to go to the University of Baghdad as exchange students. This was right after OPEC was formed. Iraq had lots of money. They're throwing it around. Some of it came our way. The five of us go, and we spend a year there. Now, my connection was with Stokely Carmichael, mainly Bob Moses. I became good friends with him, an icon in the civil rights movement right now. And we were supposed to use their tactic that turned out to be pretty successful in the voter registration movements in the South. They form a study group. The study group in the South would discuss literature around Black Power, mainly Stokely Carmichael's book. Stokely Carmichael would then come into town and give a fiery speech that would crescendo to Black Power and a raised fist. And if the crowd responded, then the community was ready for the next phase in the mass organization. And this worked pretty well in the South. I got in touch with Stokely Carmichael, mainly Bob Moses, but also Stokely Carmichael. We went up to Chicago once and met with him and a bunch of other people. He's arguing Pan-Africanism, all African people's revolutionary party. And we're looking to deploy the same strategy around the world. Now, I'm going to Baghdad. For some reason, it's connected to Chicago and the president of Shaw at the time and Stokely Carmichael. So we go, and we're going to use the same strategy in Baghdad because the Ba'ath Socialist Party was in power and they were using all of this new oil revenue, supporting a lot of students from a lot of African countries, some of them sub-Saharan African countries. And they're sort of indoctrinating them, quote unquote, appealing to their Muslim identity. While I'm there, I guess as a hobby, but I'm to organize a study group and talk about the literature on Pan-Africanism. Walter Rodney and George Padmore, et cetera, et cetera. And Stokely Carmichael would then come to town and address the students just like he did in Mississippi and Alabama. I go there and I formed the study group. It was quite the experience of the time, actually. And Stokely Carmichael and Bob Moses did come to town, although they could not meet with the students because the movement got out of hand. I was the big man on campus. I was Muhammad Ali Clay from the United States, and there were very few people from the United States there at the time. The students decided that they're going to talk about forming a Pan-African Student Union at the University of Baghdad. And I was saying, oh, wow, this stuff really works. So I'm sitting there in one of the student houses, lots of students' houses, lots of students from Africa, thousands of students from Africa. Each had their own national house and also. We're sitting in the basement of one of these houses discussing whether or not we're going to form a Pan-African Student Union at the University of Baghdad, Iraq. And there's discussion about whether or not we're Muslim, Arab, or African. And it's good discussion. And some of my people are involved in this discussion. And I'm quite proud of them. Ooh, this stuff works. The last chapter of that meeting is the one that sticks with me out of all of my experience over there. And there were many of them, shocking cultural shocks. Like last chapter of this meeting, and I believe the reason why the Pan-African Student Union was actually formed, they voted to form it, was a group of students from Berbers from the Mediterranean coast. And they argued that they were African from the continent of Africa, and they had never been Arabized by the forces coming from Arabia, from the East, and the continent of Africa was their sort of dominant ideology. That has sort of wavered now, but back then, that's what these students were arguing. And I looked at them and I said, these are Berbers, fair skin, straight hair, not my notion of what Africa and Pan-Africanism was all about. And so, whoa, that's a shock. That's really shocked me out of my inner city, Philadelphia, United States of America notion of racial identity, of African identity. And back then, African identity and identifying with African culture was very popular at the time. I would wear dashikis all the time. So that's that story. And the reason why I tell it there and I'm telling it now is because I really would like to reconnect with some of my comrades and friends from that period. They saved my life when I got sick with food poisoning. But over the years, we've lost touch. I've never met or encountered one of them ever again. And if you're listening and this sounds at all familiar to you, this is me. This is Muhammad Ali Clay. And contact me. I'm easy to find. Just look me up on the internet. And I dedicate the book to them precisely because I think that experience, it was sort of my introduction to the liberal mind, to questioning everything. It really, and so it meant, and it still means quite a lot to me, especially while writing this book.
Yeah,
I guess
good.
we'll get into that. Okay, that's that story.
You open this book with this big picture story, which is that there is this revolutionary period in world history where we see these Western European economies develop from backward farmers into empires that colonized most of the world. And you want to argue at the same time, we see we see a revolutionary period in Africa, but it's a development in the opposite direction. And so you talk about how Europe and Africa become mirror images of each other through the process of the slave trade. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this picture of these mirror images and these opposite directions of development that you trace in the book.
Yeah, okay. So your question provides the context, that period from 13th century to the beginning of the 20th, actually. Europe is, and if you read the history of Europe, Europe is emerging from a feudal past to modernity. Africa, not so much. Asia, the Asian end of the Eurasian continent, not so much. And we have this image of how that happened in Western Europe. But when you look at Africa, it's still considered pre-colonial, before colonial occupation. Everything fits into a nice little neat package. And if you compare that view of pre-colonial Africa, which is with the view of Western Europe, you'll find that they're not just different in the sense of political system, family organization, et cetera, and identity, but they appear to be mirror images. They appear to be opposites as opposed to differences. And the book is really my meditation on how to explain that as a process that at the same time critiques this notion of a static pre-colonial Africa. That is, that Africa wasn't always that way, but this mirror image was created as much in Western Europe over this period as in Africa.
Yeah, I really like this. And I think that this is great that sometimes facing colonial history, people want to reach back to a pre-colonial Africa that on the negative side, people think of a kind of static without history. But on the other side, people are saying we can reach back to something, before something pure. But something that you're really showing here, or at least a kind of line that you're leaning into, is really this globalized interconnection, that Africa is always, for this really long period, bound up in, and I quote, the globalization of trade and its impact on the evolution of African economies and societies. And you really trace that way back in this book. How do you think about the relative impact of globalization, global trade on Africa versus these other ideas of a more internally isolated or kind of internally anchored African history?
Yeah, y'all asked deep questions.
I did warn you, Warren.
It's just so many ways to come at it.
Yeah.
One of the ways I come at it in the book is to present the history of the real value of gold on the international market. Okay? Because I think that integrates Africa into a long history, if you accept that. The prices come from England and London. It's the value of gold in the city of London. If you think that the international trade is improving and gold is a measure of international value, then let's talk about how this correlates with what we know about African history in the past. And it's consistent with a lot. It's consistent with the history, especially of the Gold Coast, which is one of the reasons why the Portuguese started to explore down the West African coast. It's definitely consistent with the accumulation of wealth and the timing of accumulation of wealth along the Gold Coast. It's also consistent with the reasons why Portuguese explorers set out in dangerous waters looking for the source of the gold in Africa, the Gold Coast, to put it precisely. And it also implies that what we know of, what we can really document about the Empire of Mali at the time, which is documented by the pilgrimage of Mansa Musa in around 1380 to Mecca, takes all this gold and the whole world is responding to all this gold inflating Egypt and Cairo. Gets into the Cantillon Atlas. So we know that this guy had a lot of gold and is considered one of the richest people in the world and all that. This pilgrimage is before the peak in the international value of gold. So if Mansa Musa is this figure, you can imagine what's happening around Timbuktu and Jin and Gao and all of that. And this is like 1492, pre-1492, pre-Columbus. So a lot's happening in this period. What happened to that is the subsequent question. When the value of gold declines, what replaces it is an explosion in the real price of African slave exports. And so that's the story that I tell of the international context of the story.
Warren, just on that point, I mean, is in that sense, that's almost a supply side story, right? It's the price of gold that leads to local responses in West Africa, whereas I think most people would think of the Atlantic slave trade, at least, as a demand side story. There were massive demands for labor in the Americas, and suddenly you've got these Europeans that see this opportunity to acquire this labor on the African continent. So how would you think about supply and demand? How does that interact to explain the Atlantic slave trade, or at least the scale of the Atlantic slave trade?
I discovered a middle ground there. Much of the literature is supply or demand, that slavery in Africa is as old as time, post-Columbian, all this land in the New World, native populations decimated. Oh, wow. We can go to Africa and buy some of their slaves, okay? And then the other side is, of course, Walter Rodney is arguing that, boom, there was no slavery in Africa, or very little slavery in Africa, before the demand for them from the New World. And that African responses to this demand sets in motion processes of enslaving people and exporting them. Middle ground is this gun slave cycle. That American demand for slaves was not just a price offer on the coast of Africa. That was an incentive to engage in slaving. But part of the price offer, the bundle of goods that was being exchanged, was firearms, guns, gunpowder. And yeah, people could be responding to the high price of that Europeans are offering for enslaved people. But then you get the guns and your cost of enslaving have declined. Boom. So you're a big person now, and you go off and enslave whoever you can enslave, a different society. That other society is then going to say, if I don't participate in this international trade, I'm going to be enslaved by this person who is participating in the international trade. So I'm going to do it, get my guns to protect myself. And once you get into that game, I call it a prisoner's dilemma, arms race of raid or be raided. It's a change in the norms of conflict. Wide. It spreads region-wide. And once you get into that, then the slave export response, the elasticity of slave exports increases. It's not one or the other. And in the book, I show this in the British trade. I have good empirical evidence of this in the British trade. And so it's not so much supply or demand, but the interaction of the two.
Yeah, that leads me to this kind of mirror image that you sketch out, which I think is really very useful, is this improvement both in incomes, as economic historians typically think, but it's also in the liberal norms and values in Western Europe compared to what we see in Africa, where we see this decline, both, I guess, in levels of prosperity, but also in these norms and values that are attached to the slave trade. My former supervisor, Jan Leiden van Zanden, wrote several years ago a guest post on my blog, and it was actually on something that I found fascinating about this question on Dutch slavery, and why is it that in the Netherlands slavery was abolished pretty early on. And yet the Dutch merchants would continue this practice, of course, in the East Indies, but also in South Africa, in the Cape Colony where we are. And there's actually this expression that I'm trying to find now, which he basically said, you're a preacher at home and a merchant abroad. And it summarizes basically what you suggest here is that within Europe, there are these norms and values that are established that say slavery is not something that we'd allow here, but yet when we leave the continent, we are happy to accept profits from a slave trade. And he mentions this really interesting incident in 1595 in the Netherlands, where there's basically a skipper that arrives with a bunch of slaves, and he tries to sell them in this Dutch city. And the mayor says, no, you're not allowed to do that. And there's actually a big court case around this. This is before the establishment of the Dutch East India Company even. There's a big court case. It's in Middelburg. And actually, the mayor wins. Slavery is then not allowed for moral reasons. And then obviously the skipper appeals. And so the slaves are actually released. They are told they must become apprentices. They are given a guild to work in, and they would become freedmen. But then the skipper appeals this decision. And based on the idea of property rights, that he owns these slaves, and the property rights being very important at this stage also in the Netherlands, he wins the case. And so he basically gets all the slaves back.
He won the property case?
He won the property case. And so he gets all the slaves back, but he's not allowed to sell them in the Netherlands. He leaves the harbor again and goes and sells them somewhere else. So basically what Jan Leyton writes is that after this case, that case has been used in European history for a long time. Basically just say that slavery won't be allowed on the continent, and yet we adhere to this property right rule. And I just found that fascinating. It feels like a pivotal moment. If you think of counterfactual history, had there been a different decision at that stage, things might have turned out very differently. So how would you think about these kinds of moments in time? Could there have been a different history than this mirror image history is the real question, I guess, here.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't tie myself to the history behind the mirror image as the only way to go, or the only thing we could have become. How Western Europe gets to define this freedom as free air, not an individual political right to freedom, but freedom that's attached to the place, the land, and the same rulings in England, century later, but the same ruling in England, that this is free air. How freedom comes to be established in Western Europe as a norm, that kind of norm, that intrigued me, to tell you the truth. And the first half of the book is really my meditation on that intrigue, trying to come to some grips with the origins of that condition of freedom. The more I read, the more I said, boy, this is a big topic. I couldn't get my arms around this. But then information kept showing itself, especially when I pursued the ideas that I found in Orlando Patterson. And that was really my crutch in this search, because he argued that there was clearly a relationship between the history of slavery in the West and the history of freedom in the West. So freedom's a norm, so I had to posit slavery and freedom as norms, which was okay. I could do that for Africa. But what about Europe? What abolished slavery in Europe? And that was the historical question. I would ask my friends, when did Europe abolish slavery? They would all tell me 1807, when they abolished the slave trade. And nobody gave me a clear answer. But when you read all the literature, freedom is a necessary condition for development, and the reason why Western Europe takes off. There were some people, Joseph Henrich recently has told a pretty interesting story about the origins of individuality and pro-sociality, which to an economist sounds like freedom. But Patterson's view is the view I went with.
I want to ask that you just define for the listeners the difference between freedom and liberty, because I found that in your book fascinating. Basically, I thought, and this might be second language English speaker, but I thought these are interchangeable. But the kind of origins of the word is actually very different.
Oh, I thank Deirdre McCluskey for pointing this out.
I imagine
Yeah,
so.
yeah. I told her that I thought liberty was freedom for people who were already free. And she took offense at that. So I looked it up. And it turns out that the definition of freedom is release from slavery or imprisonment. A Dutch, German, Frisian origin around 1225, we begin to see the use. And liberty is a very distinct but related word that sort of means freedom from sin and worldly things, and comes into use about a century and a half later and is of Latin origin. It sounds like the Catholic Church. One's the Catholic Church and one is not. So I sort of said, okay, freedom, slavery, Patterson seem to be connected, at least in terms of the origin of words. So that turned out to be another reason why I should continue along this line. Then I encountered this literature on the evolution of ransoming in Europe, because the definition of slavery is captives of war. You could have other sources of slavery once it gets going. But the definition of slavery, the opposite, is captives of war and bringing these alien people into your society. It just kept going and going. Then I encountered jus gentium, the laws of the Roman laws that then allow, as you say, Johan, traders to be ruled by different norms and different rules than people who are living on the land. Harold Berman, who wrote about the origins of Western legal tradition, argues that trade, especially, and this time around the 13th century, that trade was really distant trade, long distance trade, and that it was allowed to be self-ordered rather than written down and argued in the evolving legal tradition, because Roman laws that commented on the rules of trade were common laws, were customary laws. And those customary laws, which reflect the practices of the time, were not incorporated into the emerging Western legal tradition around this time. Customary law in Africa, customary law is sin. Customary law allowing trade to move on uncoordinated, self-ordered along the lines of Abner Greif and those folks, all seems to, in a sense, intersect with the history of slavery and freedom. So I was encouraged.
I really love this. And freedom stands as such a kind of like ideological touchstone. But of course, freedom is freedom from and freedom from slavery. And I thought that this was such an interesting thing to think through here, even as Western societies, as you trace Greco-Roman slavery and this kind of transatlantic slavery, were invested in slavery. They were creating a boundary to define freedom and valuing freedom and holding on to freedom. And so you talk about Orlando Patterson's definition of the first problem of slavery. Could you talk a little bit more about this first problem of slavery and how it creates that category of freedom as well in the process?
Ooh. All right. First problem of slavery. Patterson posits this as the problem that societies have to deal with once they bring those captives of war into their space, into their culture. You have to decide who's going to be free, who's going to be slave. And if you follow that, and if you ask that question, then you realize that there are many ways that societies have answered that. Lineal, matrilineal, Chinese, and Western, and Middle Eastern, Muslim. They're all different. They look very different, especially when you look at the reproduction of the systems. That is how non-captives, people who were born and raised in the society, are then stratified into a slave category. Now, the Western way of doing that is a pretty unique way. The Western way of doing that transfers slave status from the status of the mother and free status from the status of the father. Okay? So in Western systems, and this is unlike any other system, and if you look at the history of slavery, you'll see that there are problems with patrilineal systems incorporating slaves into their midst without calling into question the notion that status is derived from the status of the father. Okay? So if you attach slave status to the status of the women, then free men can produce free and slave children. And this is the way the Western society got around this constraint, though, on patrilineal persistence of slavery. That means, boom, it's like the Western slave system in the global sense is the system best suited for maintaining and growing slave wealth. I wouldn't use the word efficient, but it persists in the sense that there are no leakages like you find in the other slave systems.
Yeah.
So that in empire, expansion of empires and capturing slaves along the border, slavery is really a central component to Western development from Roman times, in Roman times, and the emergence of modernity. It is a uniquely Western origin of freedom from a uniquely Western culture of slavery.
Warren, I see in the economics literature that economists continue to study slavery. There's a literature that's now several decades old. The Climatic Revolution was associated with the study of slavery in the US, at least. But my question is, I guess, why is it that economists are so interested in this as a first question? And what is it that we, as economists, if I can put that out on, that we still don't yet know, that we would like to know more about this practice? Why should we keep doing this? And if we should, then what is it that we still need to investigate that we still don't really understand about slavery?
Why we keep doing it, that's an easier question to answer. The United States fought a civil war over the issue, almost tore the nation apart. I think that's why we keep doing it. It's just part of our cultural angst, our discontent, our tension, and you can see it in contemporary political, what they call culture wars. It's always there. And a lot of that goes back to a history of slavery and how the United States never really came to grips with it. And over time, it keeps cropping up as an issue that generates more freedom. More liberty for Americans. Okay, it's civil rights movement. And even today, you watch, you're going to see something, I think, come out of this trauma that we're going through right now. And I feel like I need to apologize to the world about what we're doing to it. But something's got to come out. What we don't yet know about slavery, why is it that we do not observe a withering away, if not just a withering away of this inefficient system of slavery, but why we don't see more micro adjustments? That's the big one in my book. Why we don't see more manumission, why we don't see more of this sort of this Roman peculium where individual slaves could show their talent, could show their productivity and gain their freedom. Everything we know about manumission in places that allowed it suggests that slaves were willing to pay more than the market. Of course they would. It's their freedom. Nobody's going to value it more than them. So why is it that they are not offered these contracts to show their talent and earn their freedom? Not fight a war over it, not abolish it, but just earn your freedom. I think if that had happened in the U.S. South, and sometimes it was illegal to allow slaves to do that, If that had been part of the American story, I think we would have a very different history of racial tensions in this country. So we don't know why. Brazil, I think studying Brazil, where there's some good data now being collected there, is going to have some answers.
I'll do a quick plug for work that we're doing on manumission in the Cape Colony. My colleague Kate Ekma is studying manumission exactly, but the question here is also, it's very low rates of manumission, and yet we do see it happening. But the question is, why is it so low? I've always thought about slavery as a system where, of course, it's the most coercive system. And you talk about the carrots and the sticks. Of course, the sticks with slavery is immensely high, right? These are terrible conditions. But I've never thought about the reverse, about the opportunity for freedom is also the incentive to work, to earn your own freedom is also incredibly high. And so you would actually expect that incentive should matter really a lot here. And yet, why is it that the market doesn't solve this? I found that a fascinating discussion. I really hope that we can at least contribute in the future a little bit to this literature. Let me ask one thing about the Cape then, because we are here in the Cape. There is a new emphasis also here in our department, at least, on studying the economics of slavery. How should we think about contributing to debates? Because we sit at the kind of weird position here. We're both part of the Atlantic slave trade, although less so because most of the enslaved people that come to the Cape, of course, firstly, we're a destination country, right? We're not an origin region for slaves. So this is a slave society at the Cape. But secondly, most of the enslaved come from the Indian Ocean. And so these are two very distinct literatures, it seems. The Atlantic slave trade compared to the Indian Ocean, they almost don't speak to one another. Why is that? And what is it that you think the Cape can contribute to understand perhaps something about the economics of slavery that you won't get from elsewhere? You're not allowed to say manumission because I've already said that. But
now, you say South African slaves were from the Indian Ocean, meaning East Africa or India?
So about Malaysia, India, Sri Lanka or Ceylon, Mozambique, Madagascar. So yeah, both East African coast, but predominantly from East Asian or South Asian countries.
I would think the contribution would then be the notion of race. If the notion of race emerges out of that sort of heterogeneity in the United States and the West, they were all from Africa. If you're mixing different peoples, and the West mixed different peoples too, they just called them the same. But if you're mixing different people, what do you then end up calling them? And how is their slave status reproduced? And how are the leakages blocked? Those have to be different if you have a heterogeneous system. I would think the evolution of category that they're then placed in will be a contribution.
I wanted to ask, you talk about the effect of being exposed to the slave trade on African societies and African cultures. And I thought this was really interesting. You trace out the effect of being exposed to slave trading as well as being exposed to slave capture. And so I wanted you to just tell us a little bit more what happens in these contexts. How does the impact of the slave trade begin to reshape social and political and cultural norms, as you've shown?
Yeah, for trade, first you have to recognize that form of property. And not just you, but on both sides of the market. You have to recognize that captive of war now represents wealth. Okay, and that has to be a condition of the transaction of the slave trade. Okay, so you have to recognize slave wealth. And once you do that, and if you bring them into your society, then you're in Orlando Patterson's first problem of slavery. How are you going to then adapt to this new stratification? And once that happens, then you have a whole host of questions to answer. The big one, and I'm almost completely convinced, is the key to all of this, is patriarchy and women. That it's always about how you can reproduce slaves and grow your slave value if you have control over women. Once that's the case, then you're into family, you're into, and if it doesn't go the family way, which is the way it's tends to go in Africa, matrilineal or patrilineal family structures. If it goes the family way, then slavery is embedded in the family. If you don't go the family way, then you just have this Western notion of a slave population reproduced by women in a patriarchal environment where men just go out and do whatever they want to do. And then freedom and those spheres distinctly separate. Now, in Africa, and this gets to your colonial, I think it segues into this colonial literature. I'm very interested in the effects of this abolition of slavery in Africa and the emergence of customary law. I'm beginning to believe, along with Martin Chonick's view of this, that the fact that slavery was embedded in kinship structures in Africa, as opposed to this clear separation in the West, poses these questions for colonial authorities that eventually fashions the notion and the idea of customary law, because it was in this sphere of familial rights to women and to property that raised a lot of the questions that came before the native courts, early, even late colonialism. And customary law is still there, still operative in Africa. So if slavery is really part of this, and not just slavery, but the African solutions to the first problem of slavery, not Western slavery, but African slavery. If it's this segue almost to the present that gets institutionalized as customary law, then I think that I have something there. So I'm pursuing that now. These are just my initial thoughts on that.
That brings me to what would be the final question on reparations, because I think it ties something to what you would say if I follow your final chapter. But before we get there, Warren, we have a tradition on the podcast where we use your research to produce a song. So I'm going to play you a song based on your research. It's an AI-generated song. So it's a kind of a lament about your most recent paper actually on the kind of consequences of the slave trade for Africa. We asked ChatGPT for some lyrics and Suno for the music, and so here goes. Let's listen to it.
Before the ships, the work was held by kin and land, by names well known, by ties a village understands. Then ports drew near by river, coast and caravan road, and foreign buyers turned a neighbor into load. Some captives left in chains, but that was not the whole. The trade moved inland too and altered every role. What sailed away in grief came pressing back on home, to guard, to soar, to rank, to treat a life as own. It was not only people taken to the sea. The trade changed home and changed what home could be. Where raids were feared, survival learned a bitter game. To dodge the net, some learned to cast one just the same. In catchment zones, defense began to mirror threat. The fear of capture taught the skill of casting nets. With guns and roots and middlemen that fed the coast, whole regions lived by striking first or losing with wealth and rule and household power. In East Africa, it settled deeper hour by hour. In West Africa, it joined the strength of chiefs and states. A wound became a system shaping people's fates. That is why the damage lasted after ships were gone. Less trust, less schooling too, and weaker paths to build upon. Underdevelopment was more than numbers sold. It changed how lives were linked and what the future held. It was not only people taken to the sea. The trade changed home and changed what home could be.
Thoughts, Warren?
I think you have a hit. Wow.
Am I wrong to say that you are a musician? Do you play music?
Yes, I play drums.
Thought so.
Yeah. That's moving. That's moving.
It is. It's an incredibly powerful technology. That's all I'll say. It's also a wonderful way of communicating these lessons, right? That it is a way to reach an audience that's not going to read an AR paper.
That's amazing.
Warren, let me finish with the final question, and that is about reparations.
Oh God, something comes after that? Okay, let's get down and dirty here. Reparations. Go.
I don't want to ask about reparations in the US because I think most people, when they think about reparations, they do know something about the US discussions. I really liked your discussion also of reparations in Africa, because your research shows that there are these consequences, right? That in a variety of ways, Africans still today suffer as a result the legacies of this trade. And so there could be the case for reparations, but you make some interesting proposals, and they link back to this customary law idea. So perhaps you can just share some of these ideas with us.
Yeah, like I say, these are preliminary thoughts. I need to preface with that. The idea of there being a raid or be raided arms race can sort of maybe smooth over some claims of one African group or ethnic group or against another, in the sense that blame is placed elsewhere. And maybe that blame can be attached to international claims or what have you. I don't know. I'm not an international economist. But the customary law angle, where I believe the slave experience is still felt in Africa, to me seems to be a site where this idea of freedom can motivate positive behavior, positive changes. And there are some studies that suggest that different contextual arrangements influence female participation in politics, for example. All of that's local. And customary law is the way a lot of these gender inequalities are enforced in Africa. Just seems to be a site that's ripe for the expansion of more freedoms at the local level, gender-based political struggle for gender equality. And given the way the globalization's going and the way oligarchs are gaining control of that, the local behavior, local norms and all, I think may play a larger role in the future as protection from a lot of these globalized transgressions. The more that happens, the more the positive spin on what's happening at local levels.
Warren Whatley, thank you very much for joining us for this podcast. It's It was a fascinating discussion for me, and I hope the listeners also learned a lot as I did. And hopefully they will go out and purchase the book Slavery, Freedom and Development, How Africa Became the Mirror Image of Europe.
And I really must say, the book really was a page turner. I really encourage all the listeners to go out there and grab it because it's a really wonderful book. So thank you for sharing it with us.
Thanks, Warren. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Season 2 of the Our Long Walk podcast. We'd love to hear from you. What's the one idea from today's conversation that changed your outlook? Do you have a burning question you'd like to explore, or perhaps a guest you'd love to hear from? Get in touch with us by sending an email to johan@ourlongwalk.com. That's JOHAN@ourlongwalk.com.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. You can follow us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we'd love your feedback. Visit us at ourlongwalk.com. Follow our LinkedIn page for updates, new episodes, and additional links.
This series is made possible by the Chair in Economics, History and Policy at Stellenbosch University. Visit leapstellenbosch.org for more information about our research unit in economic history.
Thanks to LEAP researcher Kelsey Lemon, who provided helpful background research. Thanks also to the team at Voice Note Productions for helping to make this podcast. Our producer is Fasti Karlitz. Sound design and editing is done by Andre Burnett. Nkosi Johan.
Dankie, Jonathan. Join us next time for another episode of Our Long Walk.
See you then.
Cheers.